Everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and today I'm here with Fern Schumer Chapman. And today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about biases and sibling estrangement. Now, biases are mental shortcuts or distortions in thinking that influence how we perceive, interpret, and respond to situations, often without us realizing it. And in the context of sibling estrangement, biases can act like invisible barriers that shape how we remember past interactions, assign blame, and justify our feelings or actions. They color our perceptions of each other, making it harder to bridge divides or see the situation from another's perspective. In today's episode, we'll be recognizing these biases and how better knowing them can help to see where and how misunderstandings deepen and how relationships drift or fall apart. So, Fern, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be with you. I remember Malcolm Gladwell talking about the brain and how so much information is coming into the brain that it has to shortcut and slice and dice in order to function. And biases play into this shortcutting, but they can be very dangerous and deceptive.
Exactly. And I think that's the thing that's important to realize is how we can bring this to consciousness, right? So that way we understand just how some biases can become a liability in some relationships, right?
Right.
And one of the first ones is confirmation bias, right? And the confirmation bias has to do with the tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms existing beliefs or opinions. Now, you've probably seen this yourself, I think, right? With some people.
Well, I was just thinking about politics. You know, we have a tendency to go to the political media that we agree with. So, it's basically a confirmation bias. So we tune in if we're extreme right wing, we tune into some of the right wing stations. And if we are a left, more towards the left or progressive, we go to the other.
Very true, right? We seek out people that will validate our opinion and such. And we see this in families as well, too, right? Unfortunately, we see triangulation in some ways, resentment of that starts to build when people get pulled in and such, and everything that comes with that, right? That can be especially difficult.
Right. The danger in a family is you go to somebody who you hope will align with you and support you. And what ends up happening is you're really triangulating and you can really build a lot of resentment and problems because this whole situation can metastasize to that person. So you really have to think twice about whether you want to consult that person and drag them into the divide as well.
Exactly. You and I were talking just before the video about the whole triangulation and such and what that does to some people and such, and I think that that's really, really important. I'm glad you brought that up, especially because a lot of us are familiar with that. A lot of us, I think, experience this within our own families. And unfortunately, when you're on the receiving end of it, it makes it really, really hard, you know.
Yeah, I find myself having to have really firm boundaries and tell myself that I am going to say to some people, this is a conversation I'm not willing to have with you.
Hmm. Exactly. So that's really, really important, of course, to be able to be careful not to fall into that trap in thinking and such. Now, a second one that people can experience is what's called attribution bias. And that has to do with a tendency to attribute others' behavior to their character while attributing our own behavior to external factors, right?
Mm. So you basically are seeing what you want to see.
Right? Exactly. So I think that that's really important to be able to catch that and to recognize that at the same time, we're very lenient towards ourselves, but we're very harsh towards other people, right? And I think that that's one of the things we need to be careful with.
I think if you combine attribution bias with confirmation bias, you have a real explosive pot.
Hmm. Exactly. And we see this in families all the time, right? Where what happens is that people are very lenient, tolerant towards themselves, and yet also ascribe some sort of negative outcome towards another person and such, and all of a sudden make it about some sort of character flaw that they have. So we hear often criticisms from our sibling right? That comes and has to do with how they see us as and such, when in fact it's not really based on reality at all.
Well, I would add, and I don't know if there's actually a term such as this, but I would say there's like an assumption bias. In other words, you go out there and you assume you know things that you don't actually know for a fact. And then you attribute behaviors to those assumptions.
So we can see in some ways just how the mind works by trying to create patterns and such that are not necessarily based on reality, you know.
Right.
Now, another one that happens is what's called the halo and horns effect. This is another type of bias that can occur where it's the tendency to let one positive or negative trait influence the overall perception of someone.
Mhm. Right. So you're completely overlooking the situation and the assumptions you're making. And for example, if you have a parent who might consistently favor one child over another due to an early achievement, which would be your halo effect, while judging the other child more harshly for a mistake, and then you hold onto these biases, that's where you get into trouble. But parents raise children differently for a lot of reasons. They raise children differently. Number one, because they're at different life stages when they have them. They may have different financial circumstances when they have them. Each child is different and may require different things from the parent. So it's dangerous to look at things through this kind of halo horn lens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really, really important not to get caught up in these types of labelings and such, you know. Unfortunately, this does still happen in some families, and it's hard to be objective because people bring in their personality traits, you know, how they are. But as you said, you know, of course, stages in life, if you're like say you're number three or number four in the family, you know, you might not get the same type of enthusiasm or energy from your parent if your parent is older, if in comparison they had their first child and they were much younger. So you see these differences that happen within families as well, where kids will say to themselves, I had a very different experience in upbringing than you did, you know.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
things to consider, of course. And now another one that happens also in terms of bias is what's called negativity bias. And this is the tendency to focus more on negative experiences than the positive ones, right?
So a sibling might dwell on a single critical comment made many years ago and then ignore all of the positive things that have been said in recent years. And in some ways, I think that's a little bit like being put in a jail because you're held to this comment that you probably don't even remember making.
Exactly, right? And that's really, really important to be able to see that as such, because if you're stuck in some sort of negative perception, it's really hard to break free of that because they'll always bring us back to that, right? Always be about coming back to that. You remember when you said this or when you did this, but you're not even that anymore, you know, and that may have been an isolated event as well. But yet, with some of our siblings, they kind of bring it back to that to justify that feeling of wanting to think that somehow they've had more negative experiences. So this is hard to get out of when you're kind of like you said, put in jail, put in the box, right? Where you're having to fight and crawl yourself out of it to not be labeled in this way.
Right. And it ends up eroding trust and increasing the emotional distance and actually preventing growth
Yes.
because you're holding somebody, you're holding their feet to the fire. They can't get out of it.
Exactly. And that's really, really important to be mindful of that and such. Now, another type of bias that exists with some people is what's called cognitive dissonance. Now, what this is that it's the discomfort that's felt when holding conflicting beliefs or attitudes, leading to a change in one to reduce the conflict, right?
So a sibling who feels guilt for distancing themselves might rationalize it by exaggerating the past grievances.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly, right? So this is the thing that can happen sometimes with that is that they will somehow make it as though something's happened in a bigger fashion, so that way it can justify, well, I'm not going to get involved with you because of that. So again, it's kind of working with kind of justifying yourself in some ways, like you and I were talking about before.
Mhm. Yeah. All of these things feel like walls to me.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, they prevent growth and connection.
Exactly. It's very isolating, I think, when people get involved with some of these biases unbeknownst to them, or, of course, getting caught in them or a few of them and such. So I think it's really, really important that we're highlighting some of these as well for our viewers. And there is one more bias I'd like to go through with you just to discuss this. And the last one we're going to be talking about today is what's called stereotyping, right? And this is assuming someone's traits or behavior is based on a generalized belief about a group that they belong to. So we've often heard about stereotyping, but within the context of sibling estrangement, it's very particular to our community.
Yeah, a parent might stereotype one child as the difficult one and treat them differently, regardless of how they actually behave. Ali John, was a real interesting article that came out, real recent research of January 2025 about favoritism in families. I don't know if you saw this, but the idea is that girls tend to be favored. And by the way, favoritism is a huge risk factor for estrangement. And the child who imposes the least demand is often favored. Of course, these are all stereotypes because, as you know, a child at 9 may not pose much demand, but that girl in adolescence may be very different.
Exactly, right. And that's the thing that happens is that we change over time, right? And
Right.
again, ascribing these labels of the golden child or the black sheep or the scapegoat and such, a lot of times we have been labeled as such in our families. And it makes it difficult to navigate that because, again, you're trying to break free of this generalization that's being put on you and such, and sometimes some people are ascribed a certain label despite themselves. May not even feel that they want to be the golden child, but yet they're treated as such. And whether they want it or not, that can be difficult as well because that can create friction between siblings when you see that there's a disparity in treatment based on that label.
Right. And think about what happens when those kids grow up and they still are living out those labels.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see how that can metastasize into something else later on. That's not always very healthy, and we really need to be careful about that, especially. So our goal today, of course, Fern, was simply to, of course, just bring in more consciousness into the concepts of bias. Now, we've gone through six of them today. There's six more I want to go through, of course, with you and that we can discuss a little bit more since this is a subject of interest for us, especially when it comes to sibling estrangement. So I'm really happy that we got a chance to discuss more about this today.
I think that if nothing else, there should be a mindfulness about bias. And before you jump to conclusions in your relationships, you might think about these six, and of course, the next six that we identify, and how they're playing out in your relationships.
I absolutely agree, and I hope that our viewers today are leaving with more awareness, more consciousness of how these can manifest. Sometimes it can be us that sometimes unbeknowingly gets involved with some of these biases. Other times it's us being subject to them by our siblings. And that's really, really important, of course, to strengthen ourselves and recognize what is going on to be able to name it and such. So that way we are able to objectify it and step out of it so that way we are much more aware of the games that happen.
Yeah,
So
I think there has to be a lot of self-talk. You know,
exactly,
basically, am I stereotyping? Am I engaging in negative bias? That sort of thing.
always good to look in, right? All right, so Fern, we're already out of time. This has been a great episode. I'm really, really happy that we got a chance to do this today. So, let's talk about resources, Fern. What would be your number one resource at this time?
Well, I do coaching and I challenge many of my clients to think about whether they're stereotyping or engaging in some sort of negative bias, making assumptions, connecting dots that aren't there. So I'm always happy to help if I can.
Absolutely. And one of my, of course, favorite resources is the Sibling Estrangement Support Group on Zoom. I like to offer some help with people in real time to be able to help them to break isolation, feel less alone, of course, and of course, strengthen and empower themselves through practical advice. Given that I offer some advice as a therapist as well to be able to break free of certain patterns and such, and simply experience more of a sense of being proactive and empowering ourselves and such. And if people want to go further with me, they can, of course, partake in my intensive workshop on improving my self esteem following sibling estrangement. I am taking some new registrants on for this. And this is going to be a small group where people can get together with me for a 4 session module. And if you want some cutting edge and some experiential tools that will be long lasting for even after the workshop, then this is what you've been waiting for. So I'm really, really happy to be able to offer this again this year, as I have been doing for a few years now. So, Fern, it's great to have you here. I'm so happy that we were able to do this again today. And
Yeah, me too.
absolutely. And I'm very much looking forward to our next episode where we continue on, of course, describing more types of biases that people can experience within our sibling estrangement community.
Yes, check your biases.
All right. Well, thanks again, Fern. I'm looking forward
Okay,
to speaking with you again.
me too.
Take care. Bye bye.